I recently had to choose a power supply for one of the products that we're gonna sell.
Oh, the top secret product.
Top secret product.
Yes.
And I have, I think, a really simple way to evaluate my power supplies. I'm going to connect them to an effects pedal and look at the noise that's added when I swap from one power supply to another.
Sounds good, let's do it.
First, a little bit of terminology for anyone with less of a background in the world of audio, specifically recording audio. Frequency or pitch is a good term to start with. Imagine you're playing a piano. When you press on the left side, the notes are low. When you press on the right side, the notes are high. The highness and lowness of a sound is called the pitch. It's also scientifically referred to as frequency, and it has to do with how fast sound waves are moving in the air. The speed at which the air is moving and how frequently it's moving means the pitch of the sound that you're listening. Faster movements are higher pitch. Slower movements are lower pitch. It's worth noting that only very simple sounds have one pitch. Complex songs and complex sounds have millions of pitches. They're changing all over the place, and they look very, very complex on the tool that we'll look at called a spectrograph. Another thing to understand is spectrograph. The two axes are the pitch and the amplitude. And so amplitude is a term that we use to refer to the loudness of a sound. So if you whisper, you're making a quiet sound. If you shout, you're making a loud sound. Amplitude is the scientific way to refer to how loud something is. So with frequency and amplitude out of the way, we can imagine a tool that could give us on one axis the frequency of a sound and on the other how loud that sound is. A spectrum analyzer creates a visual representation of both frequency and amplitude. And that's what I've got going right now on my computer. It's recording the guitar pedal that I have currently, as well as something called a function generator. A function generator is a device that will create a very simple sound and let me change the pitch and the amplitude. And we can see that happen right now. So right now, on the screen, I've got this rather low-pitched peak right there, and as I move this knob, the largest, lowest peak there is moving from left to right. I can also change it to make it slightly higher, and then you can see now that that pitch, that largest peak there, is moving left to right, and that's just a way for me to add a little bit of reference to what I'm looking at. Noise is really just another word for sound, but usually when people say noise, they mean a sound that they don't want. That's also true in the sort of scientific realm or the engineering realm. When you refer to noise, it is just sound. It will look identical on this spectrum graph, but it will be sound that we do not want. So just a fun, quick aside about power in general. These are called power supplies. They do not supply power. They convert some form of energy into another. The only real power supply that people talk about is the sun. Almost all of the energy we have on Earth comes from the sun, except for nuclear. That comes from different stars, but that's we're not going to get into that. So I've collected a large amount of various power supplies here. There's a couple that I bought. There's the one that we're evaluating for one of our products. There are two linear power supplies. There's a USB power supply adapter, and then a nice expensive professional power supply, and as well as a battery. So I can swap all these out and we can look at what they sound like on the spectrograph. So these fall into a couple of main categories: the linear power supplies, the switch mode power supplies, and the battery. So the linear power supply is the simplest. They're typically quiet, but they are inefficient, and they're rather large. If you look at it compared to one of these, this is 3-4 times the weight and size. The inefficiency thing is actually important. These are usually about 50%. So half of the power that you're using to operate the thing just goes into heat. You can't use it. Quite a while ago, these were very, very common. You can't sell these anymore because they were used to charge cell phones. Even when they're just plugged into the wall, not charging anything, you still have that loss, that enormous inefficiency. And with millions and millions of people plugging these into walls, we realized that's not sustainable. It's a large demand on the power infrastructure, and it was just this giant waste. So we changed the laws and said these are no longer acceptable. They also have other issues. They rely heavily on the format of the power that they're being connected to. There's a lot of different outlets in the world. It means you have to have different power adapters for each country you want to sell it in, because it's tied to the frequency of the alternating current that's in the wall where you're selling the product. It's a real pain for people trying to make a product like us. You have to pack a different power supply for each country that you want to sell it in. They're region specific. And so now we can talk about another type of power supply, one that came after. Well, they both exist at the same time, but these became a lot more prevalent once we realized that linear power supplies were inefficient. They're called switch mode power supplies, or switching power supplies, and different types of power supplies, as scientists and engineers will refer to as topologies. So this topology is different than a linear power supply. They are generally the most common now type of power supply that you have. These are way more compact and efficient. These are pretty universal when it comes to portable electronics. If your product came with a power supply, it's likely to be a switch mode power supply like this. However, they have a reputation for being noisy, which is no longer the case. Originally, when we had to switch from linear power supplies in the audio industry to switch mode power supplies, they had a bad reputation for being noisy. They weren't really designed for audio originally. They were designed to be used with small electronics and to be really efficient. I expect the linear power supply will have a 60 hertz bump because the way these work, they rectify the alternating current from the wall, and the wall's alternating current alternates at 60 times a second, or 60 hertz. So we might see that, or a multiple of that frequency. I expect the least expensive power supplies to be the noisiest, and I will compare that to my baseline, which will be a battery. The battery is not connected to the wall at all, so none of the noise from the wall or from the power supply exists. It will just power the pedal. I'm also looking forward to seeing how the professional grade power supply stacks up with the rest of them. I am going to start with the battery as a baseline. This should be the quietest. Pop that in, turn it on. Yeah, that's what I expect right across the bottom. It's just a little wiggly. There's no kind of peaks that are coming up. So that's the battery. This is where we start. I'm going to use this linear power supply that I got off eBay first, and I've got a polarity reversing cable attached to it. So I'll plug it in, and we'll see I can already see a couple of peaks here, one big peak here, and what I assume are harmonics a little higher. This peak is at about 120 hertz, which I expect based on the way this power supply works. Here's my second eBay score. Now, turn it on. This is certainly louder than the battery. It also has a peak at about 120 hertz. Now on to the ones that are sold for guitar pedals. The first one being the Donner brand. Plug this guy in, power him on, and yes, it's quieter, certainly. These peaks are lower, and this peak is not at 120, it's at about 60. Next is the Diodario. Get right in there, turns on, and it is very similar to the Donner in terms of the type of noise that I see. Very quiet though. This is the ubiquitous one spot. If you're a guitar player, you probably own one of these, or you have a friend that does. Very, very, very popular power supply. A bit quieter than the others, not a huge amount quieter, but a very similar profile to the other ones that were switch mode power supplies. Now, the sample that I got from my supplier. Let's see if it looks good. Well, that's great. It looks really good. It looks just as good as these. Passes the sniff test. That's really great. And now I'm going to try something a bit different. I've been wondering, with the new USB-C protocol, if you can use it to generate 9 volts. So this is just my telephone charger, USB-C, and I've bought a USB to 2.1 millimeter cable. So as I understand it, there's a little bit of smarts in here that says, hey, USB-C, I want 9 volts or 12 volts or 20 volts or whatever. This one is set to 9 volts. And we'll see how noisy it is in a pinch. This would be a useful way to power a guitar pedal. Here we go. Take a look at that. And that's great. It is as quiet as these Switchmo's power supplies, which makes sense, it's the same technology. That's wonderful to know that in a pinch you can get one of these cables and just use your cell phone charger. Do you get what you pay for? How quiet is the really expensive Pro Audio power supply? Let's find out. I think we're gonna be impressed. Here we go. Is far better than these small power supplies, but that makes sense. This is a much more expensive piece of gear. It probably has a lot more filtering. It looks almost like the battery. In fact, we can go back to the battery and compare the two. They look pretty similar. Yeah, the battery's slightly quieter. There's our roundup. While most modern audio-grade power supplies aren't likely to introduce any noise that you'd be able to hear in a real-world situation, if you do hear noise when swapping power supplies, investing in a high-end professional power supply could be worth it for you. There are also several other reasons why you might be experiencing noise in your signal chain, which we'll get to in a future video. I've tested a lot of power supplies. I never thought I'd have this much fun doing this. It really helped me make a decision. I hope you guys did too, and this is something you can definitely try with very little gear. Well, that was interesting.
Yeah, it was really cool to visualize what noise looks like when it comes to a power supply.
The linear power supplies look different than the switching power supplies.
Yeah.
The really expensive one, looks almost like a battery. It's really wild how varied those power supplies are. I definitely didn't realize how easy it would be to set up something like that, where you could just easily change out your power supplies and say, hey, actually, look, this one is quieter.
Yeah, try it at home.
Yeah, you should definitely try it at home.
All right, I think that's it for today. See you later.